All right, hi, my name is Dr. Jinsy Andrews. I'm the co-chair of NEALS, and I intentionally, I'm also an ALS neurologist and the director of neuromuscular clinical trials at Columbia University in New York. And today I'm going to talk about some strategic partnerships that NEALS as an organization has accomplished and plan to do in order to drive and accelerate research and clinical trials so that we can eventually get to meaningful therapies for both sporadic and genetic ALS. I intentionally did not put names and faces here because I feel like NEALS sometimes is affiliated with individuals or groups of individuals, but I have been the chair for NEALS for the last 4 years, and it's a democratic process, so there's an election, and I have the privilege of being reelected this year for another 4-year term. And I really want to make it a platform where it is us leveraging all together all the people who are touched by ALS in any which way, and NEALS becomes a platform for us to connect and drive innovation so we can move forward together as one, which is why I'm here at the International Alliance. This is actually my first International Alliance meeting, and so yes, yeah, hey, every step counts. So I wanted to just kind of introduce, some of you already know what NEALS is, but I want to introduce it to a broader audience and try to see if we can collaborate more globally. The International Alliance, I have to thank them for the opportunity to be here and also participate, and actually their support in us trying to evolve our organization. So NEALS, about us, we have NEALS members. There's now over 155 sites that are academic research centers participating in clinical trials. We have a scientific advisory board, and we have coordinating centers, which has been the heart and soul of the NEALS organization. It started in 1995, and it's grown from a small group of 9 sites to over 155 over the last 25 years. And it was really about trying to organize and network for clinical trials. That was it. It was very simple, but of course, as all of you know, the landscape has evolved, and it has become more of a broader scope. And of course, one of our core strengths is not only the Scientific Advisory Board and the clinical research centers, but also a biorepository that is now being synergized with other biorepositories. So what do? We do clinical trials, obviously, but we've had to grow over the course of time. And so we have tried to leverage our expertise with the experience with ALS, with committees focusing on specific areas. So initially it was just clinical trials focused. So assessments, clinical trial design, coordinator training, evaluator training, investigator training, but that's now scoped out to more trainings that involve respiratory care. So we've partnered with respiratory therapists and pulmonologists, nutritional care. So those are some of our NEALS committees. Genetics, which you just heard about, has been a growing area that we've really relied on those with lived experiences to educate us back and how we can help move those types of clinical trial and development forward. And of course, more recently, the NEALS affiliated trials, so partnering with pharma and investigators that are conducting clinical trials and engaging the community. So it's not just engaging NEALS, engaging the community out, but developing partnerships for us to be informed back in and how we can evolve going forward. So this is the executive committee, all volunteers. So I'm a volunteer co-chair. I have a day job, which is in clinic and doing clinical trials at my university. But I spend a lot of time being the co-chair, and these individuals on the executive committee help lead. Everyone is elected, for the most part, on the leadership committee. We also have a scientific advisory board that does a lot of, these guys have some preclinical science background that help to advise individuals, whether they're investigators, researchers at universities, or at sponsors or pharma companies that are developing or trying to enter into the ALS space. We try to provide guidance for them. And then more recently, I just wanted to put up, we have the NEALS Information and Community Education. We call it the NICE community. This is a very recent development, and the individuals here have come together. They're appointed by the executive committee to try to address real-time hot topics and educational gaps in the field that we need to address. So they help provide guidance on topics that we need to talk about on webinars, for example, or they help us to partner with other organizations in their efforts for community education. And we also try to develop manuscripts, white papers that might address a certain place, a certain item that might be, that might need clarification. And the Global Research and Outreach Leadership Working Group, this is the working group, so these two working groups are within the last 2 years. And this is probably why Niels is here today. So we have membership. The United States is a very unique place. We're made up of a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds. And I've gotten a lot of questions about our GROW committee. So it's not for Niels to grow out and try to take over the world, but really create partnerships and collaborations with areas that might not have any infrastructure. So this is where our partnership with the International Alliance has blossomed over the last year. It is not us going out to those regions, but in fact, countries or investigators in certain regions that doesn't have developed consortia or advocacy groups, they've reached out to certain members. For example, I'm from India, so I have colleagues that are in India that have been trying to develop an ALS specialty. So a lot of our membership has special kind of backgrounds that can help kind of mentor these sites. So también yo puedo hablar español y yo trabajo en Nueva York, so mucha gente habla en español. So, and also, my ama never taught me Hindi, but I'm also multilingual. എനിക്ക് മലയാളം പറയാൻ പക്ഷേ എൻ്റെ അമ്മ ഹിന്ദി പഠിപ്പിച്ചില്ല. So I had a lot of Indian colleagues that are from North India that speak Hindi. I just said my mom never taught me Hindi, but I speak Malayalam, which is from South India. So there's a lot of people that are within our membership that can actually, because of their background, mentor in those specific regions. And so this is how our GROW committee has come about. And the next step, which is actually part of our Research Networks panel today, is collaborating globally so that we can connect them to their regional consortia or help develop through the International Alliance advocacy groups. So this is a very different partnership for Niels. In its history, we haven't done something like this. It's very hard to do. It takes a lot of commitment, again, volunteers. And of course, we are a mighty, mighty consortium of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. So we have an executive operation team. These are the employees led by our fearless leader, Carly Allen, and of course, Beverly Smits and Christina Smith, and Jennifer Heinley and Allison Boulay. So we're very lucky to have them, but they do everything. So we don't have a special legal team. We don't have a special social communications, public relations team. We just do everything and try to reach out for help when we need it. And so what have we accomplished? So we're learning as we're going that collaboration has been the key. Niels has provided the platform for that. And so we try to provide, we have a lot of scientists and researchers that have expertise globally. And so we try to provide feedback to developing programs. We try to encourage people who are outside of our field, epidemiologists, scientific researchers that are studying different areas that might be relevant to ALS to bring them into the field. So those types of scientific partnerships, ongoing collaborations with the Scientific Advisory Board, and then trying to employ group dynamics, so partnering with organizations, with people with lived experience, and bringing them together in small groups and learning how to be more effective in communications, and then driving that learning into innovation. I know it doesn't sound like hard science. It's not what I learned in medical school, but it is extremely effective and really needed in our field. And so one of the ways that we've really fostered this collaboration or strategic partnerships is through the Niels affiliated trial process. So Niels provides expertise to investigators or pharma companies that are developing a drug, an experimental drug for ALS, and will help them through the process of design, through preclinical experiments, trying to announce their opening and try to provide milestones, also conducting investigator meetings and engage with the community, and also try to make sure those trials are rigorously designed and that we manage to get through completion. And so we've grown the portfolio. It's still growing. There's still studies that are not there. They're both for sporadic ALS and for genetic ALS, and we're trying to grow that pipeline. In addition, in the US, we've had some growing interest in expanded access or compassionate use programs. So we run these in parallel and have managed to launch them finally at the end of this year in parallel to our clinical trials. And so we've been able to preserve the integrity of clinical trial enrollment while enrolling in these parallel studies for compassionate use. And the last kind of arm to that, so I talked about clinical trials, compassionate use, is also growing this kind of natural history. I started this talk by talking about biorepository, but all of these things require funding, sustainability, and these are hard because funders don't like to fund just infrastructure, people to maintain things. And so we've been fortunate that the NIH and the government has helped to fund a collaboration across pharma, across clinical trial experts and researchers to develop this entity called ALS. This is an actual partnership with the government funding agency to provide a sustainable, prospectively collected, large natural history repository. And actually we learned how to structure this through the FTD groups. And so FTD, frontotemporal dementia, already had all FTD, and so we learned how to put the pieces together through this. And so AMP-ALS is Accelerated Medicine's partnership. It's already been employed for Parkinson's disease, and it's a group or a partnership between, in the United States, the government funding agency called the NIH and the FDA, which is the regulatory authority that approves drugs. And that partnership is with stakeholders that are developing experimental drugs in ALS. This is the largest consortium in history in the United States for ALS, that's dedicated for ALS. So initially, there'll be 34 sites. There'll be the goal to enroll 2,000 people living with ALS, but also it's the first time we have a multi-center effort to enroll those who are at risk, who carry a genetic mutation that we know may cause ALS. And so through this, we'll be able to collect it, put it into a larger biorepository beyond NEALS that'll be housed at the National Institute of Health. That means that there's funding at the government level to continually sustain this effort, and it's free for researchers to access all over the world, and it will be accessible. So this is, I think, one of the major collaborations with government stakeholders, with people living with ALS and clinical trial experts to really create this large-scale database, because this is the only way we're going to answer the question of how we're going to cure this disease, is really to have these large, big-scale databases and try to synergize them with other databases that are also launching and trying to merge them all together for open science. So I think at the end of the day, we will try to achieve that. Last bit of notes here, I told you about the committees. This wheel had like 4 or 5 committees. Now it's got so many because the field has evolved to kind of target different areas that are important for clinical care and clinical research in ALS. I mentioned the biorepository, which houses spinal fluid, clinical data, serum samples, plasma samples. And of course, our annual meeting, which is in October. Unfortunately, this past year, we had weather. Mother Nature took her toll on us, and we had to do our meeting virtually for the first time since COVID. But we still managed, and interestingly enough, we had the most number of attendees this year virtually than we've ever had in our history. And this continues to be a growing meeting where networking and collaborations kind of come about. And we do a lot of partnership with members to keep them trained. Why? As drugs move through the pipeline, we've been so focused on just finding experimental therapies to do for clinical trials, but what comes next? So with Radicava or Edaravone that was approved in the United States and recent approvals with tofersen or Qalsody, our sites have to be ready for inspection, ready to do high quality studies that'll be investigated or reviewed by multiple regulatory authorities around the world. So we do a lot of member trainings. We do site management training to make sure they're ready and tight in terms of inspections, and make sure that the process, because a drug may be good, but if you don't actually do it well and with high quality and reliability of data collection and assessments, a working drug may not show an effect. And I've actually worked on the back end of large multi-center clinical trials where if you roll centers in or take centers out, you can see an effect of a drug or you lose an effect of a drug. So it's so important. And then, of course, making sure that outcomes are assessed the same way. Investigator trainings obviously is very important as we need to draw more people into the field, and then training for compassionate use as those portfolios continue. And last, people with lived experience has been the center or core of the evolution for NEALS in the last 4 years. So our Clinical Research Learning Institute started at NEALS, now is done broadly. The International Alliance has partnered with us for this. activity, which has empowered legislation, advocacy, and awareness. And then the Patient Education Advocacy Committee has also been crucial in trying to provide education to the community and partner and foster these collaborative partnerships. And the Patient Advisory Committee, which is the newest formed group, they actually are key individuals that provide us, the leadership and the organization, information on how to improve ourselves in the evolving landscape, but also help to provide guidance to the broader community. And so with that, I'll conclude and take questions.
Thank you, Jinsy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor. This is Jean with End the Legacy. Niels is so amazing. You're so amazing. We're so happy you're here, especially as a clinician who's got so many other things on their plate. I had a question as a leadership for Niels. You know, there's this thing where you guys have done clearly such an amazing job bringing biotech into ALS, and there's all these trials. And then for FTD, you know, there's just much more generous government funding for dementia research than there is for other neurological diseases. You know, can we not kind of marry these diseases that we know are so connected a little better so that there's a shared pursuit of pharmaceutical development and also generous government funding? So thank you.
Yeah, you guys did a great job on your presentation, by the way. Rocked it. Side note. But Jean, that's a great question. I'll tell you that I actually agree with you that leveraging FTD, but not only just FTD, how about Alzheimer's, how about Parkinson's, how about MS? And I think then we become larger in number and more powerful in motion and action. So I have to say that the NIH is actually very aware, the NINDS, when they're speaking to all ALS and all of the funded programs, they are talking to us about looking at the NIA and also other areas that fund FTD. It's funny, you stole my thunder. We just started talking to the FTD group, and Niels' leadership will now meet regularly with the FTD group to see how we can incorporate or do some shared, aligned kind of goals. I also, as Niels work with the Cures Collective, which is a newly launched program, yay, with IMALS, who has kind of hosted this, but trying to raise awareness, because when we talk about ALS is so small, and just a teaser, you know, IMALS has launched a little, I don't know if I can talk about it. They launched about the survey. I got a thumbs up. So there's a survey where more information will come, but really the awareness, the public awareness about ALS is so small. And of course, the prevalence is much less than Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but we are like overshadowed by the other neurodegenerative disorders. If we could talk about neurodegenerative disorders, right, we would have more power in funding, we would have more power in action, we'd have more power in advocacy and legislation. So I think this is where there's so much work. I mean, I'm doing this all on like time outside of my major responsibilities, but trying to get those communities together would be really important. I think that's the future.
A question about, sorry. This one.
So I'm David Busek, a patient fellow, and also went through the Curly training, which was wonderful. I may be borrowing trouble here, but I'm concerned in the next U.S. administration that we're going to be getting a big assault on public funding, and a lot of what you were talking about was public funding. So is Niels looking at, or other organizations looking at, how we can, are there things that we need to be doing now to help protect the gains that we've gotten in government funding over the last 5 years or so?
That's a great question. You're going to make me sweat up here on the podium. So I will say this is a very critical issue. Right now, because of all of the different clinical trial reads out earlier this year, we have a little bit of a dry spell in terms of late phase clinical trials, and much of what's available to those living with ALS right now is government funded. And much of it in the United States is funded through what's the legislation called Act for ALS. It is very critical right now that people living with ALS, anyone related to ALS, clinicians and specialists, really try to engage their congresspeople or government representatives to ensure why it's important to continue funding. I can't predict what's going to happen with the new administration that's now in place, but we have to act from the grassroots. It works. It really works. Having gone to Congress and having gone to the Capitol Hill, there were people there that had letters from people living with ALS that wrote to them. They actually knew the story. So it's very impactful to really, I think more than coming from me as an ALS clinician, coming from those living with ALS, it actually makes a difference. I've seen it on the European side as well, having people living with ALS or their own family members come and speaking directly to payers, to government entities. I've actually been in the room where it made a complete difference.
Do we have a question online?
So, Jessica Mabe from Colombia. Okay. So I wanted to ask you, as you're aware, there are so many parts of the world where currently there's no research or access to clinical trials. What would you say would be the starting point for these countries to get going? Like, what's the first step to start that process?
I think I used to say the first step was trying to get a physician or a researcher involved in ALS. But I don't know if all of you know, I have family members now that are now diagnosed. I've been doing ALS for 20 years. I now have an uncle with ALS and a cousin with ALS. And so trying to go to India and trying to figure it out. I think it actually starts with organizing the people who have the disease and creating kind of a network. So people with the disease or people who've been affected by the disease coming together, creating a network, and then finding a physician or a researcher to kind of champion that with them will help to start creating a network. And then the next step, I think, is trying to create centers that can develop expertise or specialty in that disease. It may not be many, it may be one or two, but that's a start. And then they'll engage others to come into this space. Once you're there, clinical care can start. But the research part comes after that. And that's, I think, how some of these regions without consortia came to NEALS to ask for help, because then we help mentor them and then connect them with sponsors and try to engage their regional. One of the major limitations in some of these underdeveloped areas is the regulatory authority is not ready for them, or they haven't been involved in ALS research. So I think that's why some sponsors may not go to some territories until they have some better relationships with those regulatory authorities that approve drugs.
Matt?
We going? Yeah. Thank you for that presentation. It looks like an incredibly broad and well-structured organisation that you have. You kind of touched on the fact that there's government funding plays a large role in your organisation and the coordination of it. To what extent is there private funding or fundraising, and is philanthropy largely from people who are connected to ALS and MND, or does the American community have some sort of sense of leaning into this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of organizations here that can talk about it, but I think philanthropy mostly comes from those who are touched by ALS or familiar with it. The part of the trouble, so this organization has been around way longer than I have, and so well, that may not be true, but but I think longer than I've been chair anyway, trying to change and evolve it is very tough once it gets this big. So that's been like one of my kind of tasks for the next 4 years. The issue with NEALS is that NEALS in the United States and the other regions are member institutions. So they're not, I'm not an individual member. So what happens is we have state and federal institutions that are part of our membership, and they have lobbying rules. So often I get asked, like, why aren't you going as NEALS or writing a consensus statement about, like, as NEALS? And so we can't do that because there are federal regulations or rules that prevent us from going against maybe an institution's laws. So we have to abide by the rules of the institution. And when we have many institutions, we can't do certain things. But we can definitely educate, right? So I can't do advocacy and lobbying a congressman as NEALS. I can do it as a doctor that treats ALS patients. I can write or present why it's important that this law or legislation is important for people living with ALS or for clinics. So right now the Better Care Act is on the floor to improve funding for ALS clinics, and I can explain why that's important. So that's kind of hard to do. So lobbying or advocating for these laws are hard. So that's why we really need people with the disease or who are connected to them to do it. The private sector is a little shy right now to fund specific drug programs. I mean, they'll fund a lot of education programs and activities and meetings, but we have to try to encourage anyone who's in the funding space, whether that's government entities or private funders, that there is a reason to be in this space. We know a lot about this space. We are working together, and we are not in disagreement that we need to move therapies forward. We have to send that message globally. Because funders, like from the United States, may fund other regions outside of the United States. People from outside the United States may fund into the United States. So that's a very important thing that we must do as a community now.
Thank you, Jinsy. Just a quick question from me. You obviously have a wide range of committees in the NEALS program, and a couple of those are focused on for people with lived experience. I think the Peace and the Patient Advisory Committee. What sort of representation of lived experience do you have in your other committees? Do you invite, say, some of your ambassadors or something onto all the other committees as well?
Yeah, we do try to involve the research ambassadors in all of the subcommittees. We do have a specific nominated member that a person with lived experience, whether they're a person with the disease or a caregiver, that becomes an executive advisor to our. These are all recent changes, by the way, and I think we're prompted by people coming to us and telling us that this was needed. And now I think there's more of a push to incorporate what we call patient advisory committees or committees with lived experiences to be part of a steering committee or a data safety monitoring committee. So all of the government-funded studies now incorporate individuals with experience in ALS in those committees, and that's something we should just continue to do more of going forward.
And do you find that the pharma companies are becoming more and more embracing of taking that lived experience voice into their design for trials or studies?
I think from my perspective and what I've experienced, I think that there is kind of an openness for people with lived experience to inform drug companies in their clinical development program. Why? Because right now we don't have very solid footing except for survival as an outcome measure for regulatory authorities. So when they're doing drug development, it's very important for them to hear from those with lived experience what is important to them and why. So we may not have regulatory validated outcome, but we heard from a community of people with lived experience that that was important to them. And regulators across the globe take that into heavy consideration, especially if it is a statistically significant endpoint, regardless of experts' opinion.
Thank you, Jinsy. We'll have to wrap it up now, but please do keep coming to the Alliance meetings.
Thank you.
Really appreciate that.